Hello, everybody. Welcome to McDuff Lives. I'm John O'Loughlin, and it's Tuesday morning here in the East Coast of the United States, Tuesday afternoon over in Potsdam, Germany, where we are happy to join with our good friend Harley Schlanger for another hour of kind of mutual getting up to speed after 2 weeks apart. And well, Harley, it's almost Christmas, so Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Hope your Hanukkah season has been excellent, and all the same to everyone else, and welcome.
Frohe Weihnachten to you and your wife.
Bitteschön. And I'll tell her you said that. Yeah, she's fighting. She doesn't want to she doesn't let me make her she doesn't let me try to force her to learn German words, For some reason, she just like, I don't want to know that. But she's picking up. We watch these German crime shows with subtitles.
I have the same problem with my son, who refuses to learn the articles, the der, die, das.
Yeah.
He wants a T-shirt that says der, die, das, WTF.
I know the feeling.
Yeah.
It reminds me of my college days and trying to memorize all of those for the der die das conjugate. I mean, declination of the nouns.
Den. Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, but it's really triply difficult because there's three genders in German and there's only two in French and Spanish, so it's like an extra layer of complication. But
well, the woke people are trying to change that to create 40 or 50 genders.
Well, how many? They don't even have enough letters in the alphabet for that.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, I'm glad we're able to get a laugh in here in between a lot of very difficult stories that you report on and that we study here at McDuff Lives. So where should we start?
Well, let me start with something interesting that happened here in Berlin yesterday. There was a tractorcade. There were about 3,000 farmers with tractors coming through the city, coming to the Brandenburg Gate from 5 different directions. They had signs that said, our Christmas wish, a new government. They were very high-spirited. Even though they tied up traffic, people were honking and giving them waves, and very happy to see them, because the government here is now, in the latest polls, the 3 parties add up to about 32%. Schultz is falling through the floor. The Greens are now at 12%. The Free Democrats are at 5%. And what they just did, because of the budget deficit, is they cut the subsidies for diesel fuel, which means farmers can't afford to produce. Then plus the energy prices in general. Fertilizer prices have gone way up because of the shortages of natural gas and other constituent elements in it. So it was one of these moments where what came together was the anger about the failure of the parties to come up with an agreement to make up for a huge hole in the budget. The idea that they're going to spend more on defense. The defense minister says Germany must become war ready. And anyone who hears that, who remembers the last century, has to ask themselves, how can a German defense minister say something like that? So it was just a moment where you could see the passivity of the German people is starting to fade. And what we're seeing now is an emergence of a somewhat angry electorate. And by the way, the other thing, people ask me, well, then, if it's only 32% supporting the 3 coalition partners, why doesn't the opposition bring down the government? Because you can do that with a no confidence vote. Well, the leading opposition party is the Christian Democrats, and they're at about 34%. But the only way they could form a majority would be if they had a grand coalition with the SPD, the Schultz party, which they're not going to do. Or they could form an alliance with the so-called far-right party, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is at about 23% in the polls. but all the major parties say no, this is a fascist party, it's a right-wing party, it's white nationalism. It's what you hear in the United States all the time. So there's no way out in the current configuration. And that's why when the farmers march, it sparked this sense for a moment that maybe the people are moving. And it reminded me of the chants from 1989 that brought down the East German communist regime: Wir sind das Volk, we are the people. So maybe the people are starting to rouse themselves in Germany. It would be important for some grouping in Europe to break with the status quo.
Rouse yourselves. It's time. You have to. You can't.
Wach it auf, as Bach said.
Wach it auf. Yes, that's right. Don't be a sleeping sheep.
Yeah.
And that's the trouble. But you've been seduced to sleep. Just like the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wizard of Oz seduces everybody to sleep. And being asleep, is comfortable, and it's very, they can do things to make you want to not wake up. But and they can give you fake reality that makes you think you woke up, but you really didn't. It really is that bad. So that's picking up, in a way from the studies I've been doing this week. I had the pleasure of reading some old 2009 articles, 2008 articles in EIR, Harley, by Richard Freeman and Jeffrey Steinberg about Michael Bloomberg.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that this was really, matter of fact, I'm probably going to do a show on these two EIR articles, because it ties together so many things. It ties together Sullivan and Cromwell and the Dulles brothers with the synarchy,
Yeah.
and also with the British, MI5 and the City of London and the Chatham House and all of that, and that the influence and both British and Dutch influence, by the way, on Michael Bloomberg, which is it explains the depth of what's happened to our cities in America and probably around the world. But I think, I think of Hartford, Connecticut. I think of New York, Cleveland, so many cities that in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they just gutted the industry out of them and took the tax base away, and the values went down and the crime went up, and the derelict properties started appearing everywhere. And what was behind that? Well, we've talked about Felix Rohatyn and the New York Authority and what went on there. That's recounted.
Big Mac program.
The Big Mac program, exactly.
And Municipal Assistance Corporation, which was essentially, the important thing about Bloomberg's alliance with Rohatyn is that they pushed this public-private partnership plan, which is basically a way of taking down public infrastructure, giving it to robber barons who can try to figure out how to squeeze some money out of it, as opposed to having a policy which invests in modernizing and building infrastructure for the sake of improving the whole economy. And in that sense, Rohatyn is one of the leading thieves. He comes from Lazard Frères, the French banking house connected to the Rothschilds. But Rohatyn played a huge influence during the Clinton administration. And then he and Bloomberg worked very closely with Arnold Schwarzenegger when he became governor of California, pushing the same thing. So you're right to look at Bloomberg, who, by the way, is now Sir Michael Bloomberg. He was knighted by the Queen for his services.
And the big theme of the articles is that this is the attempt by these old ultra-rich financial powers to reimpose the 14th century on the world, in the sense of you're going to have cities like, Rahm Emanuel even wrote a book about how cities are going to be the coming power. and they're all going to be subordinate to some, totalitarian world authority. But within that, they're going to be fiefdoms.
Yeah.
They're going to be oligarchies, and they're going to be, exactly what they did with Russia. And they're going to do that. They're trying to do that here in the United States. And in order to do that, they have to destroy the sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty, and the Constitution of the United States. They just got to destroy it. And so that's where I think, the battle is. This election is, unfortunately, I don't think Trump is the right standard bearer for the sovereignty argument, but he's the only one that we've got. Whereas on the other side, you've got Biden and whoever whatever Biden surrogate that ends up running is going to be the same thing. That is going to continue this drift toward these toward serfdom for 99% of us.
Well, John, I have a book to recommend to you by Walt Wriston. You may remember him, the man at Citicorp who hired Robert Rubin, who pushed Citicorp into the forefront of banking. He wrote a book, I think in 1985, called The Twilight of Sovereignty. And in it, he just goes through a kind of a map for what we're seeing with the attempt to circumvent sovereign nations and instead have global institutions that are largely staffed by technocrats who work under the direction of global cartels. And it's a very straightforward book. And he says, this, like Schwab, you're going to like it. It's going to be good for you. You may not think so, but it will be good for you. And what he means by that is he's writing it for the oligarchs, saying you're going to make more money than you ever dreamed of once this is established. And that's the whole idea, whether it's called public-private partnership. They got Clinton to go along with something called pay-as-you-go, which Clinton actually worked out with Newt Gingrich. So you had, again, this Al Gore, Clinton, Gingrich alliance. And what it really represents is a way to not spend any federal money on infrastructure, because you can't really make money from infrastructure. The whole point of infrastructure is to facilitate an improved productivity standard for things such as energy production, transportation, and so on, which ultimately cheapens the cost of everything, but it doesn't make money. But if you try to make infrastructure into a for-profit operation, which is what they tried to convince Clinton to do, what it means is the government invests nothing in infrastructure. You privatize roads and tunnels and things of that sort so private speculators can make money. And in the meantime, how do they make money? They don't reinvest. They don't fix things that break. And this is what we're seeing now with Javier Milei, the new hero of the free enterprise crowd and the new president of Argentina. So this is important, that the Bloomberg-Rohatyn nexus is really quite important to investigate in terms of the relationship with, as you mentioned, Sullivan and Cromwell, the New York law firms, the connections to the private banks, the Federal Reserve, and so on. You know, Rohatyn's Lazard Frere, the person who, Meyer, who ran it, was the one who bought the Washington Post and gave it to his daughter, Catherine Meyer Graham. And the Washington Post served as an outpost of the City of London synarchy in the nation's capital.
Absolutely. And what does it serve as now?
Well, under Bezos, it's no different.
Yeah, it's the Five Eyes bulletin. Here's all the news we want to tell you, and a bunch of lies that we're going to make you believe.
Yeah.
I don't even look at it anymore, frankly. It's a sad thing. Well, what's going on good in the world that you can tell us about?
Well, I mean, in a sense, if you invert it, what's good is that the credibility of this war party in the United States and NATO is going down to zero. The credibility of the international banks and financial fixers, that's collapsing also. So people may not know what they want or need, but they know what they don't like. They don't trust the government. They don't like the government. They don't like the bureaucrats. They, in fact, fear the government in many ways. And that's probably a positive first step. But you've got to go beyond that. You can't just organize a new system based on hatred of the old system. And that's why what we try to do is figure out why the system's imploding. What's the policy that's not working? What's the thinking that goes into it? And then, when you start studying who makes the policy, what you find is that these are a bunch of arrogant elitists who think they're better, who think they know better than everyone else. And therefore, it's okay if they lie, cheat, and steal. They're doing it for you. They're becoming billionaires on your behalf. So as people begin to discover that, things can change. That's why it's important in Germany. As I said, people don't know what they need to get out of this crisis, but they've tried the green policy for the last 5 years. Now people can't afford electricity. They can't afford energy. So the green policy is becoming discredited, except for a small group of extremist ideologues. The Free Democratic Party, which is the party of the Austrian school, the total free enterprise, free market party, what their policies are doing are they're not working. They're leading to cartelization, to monopoly, the driving out of the Mittelstand, the medium and small enterprises that make up the engine of economic growth. So people are beginning to discover that this is a bad idea. So, what's going to come out of it? Well, an interesting development, which I think shows how panicked these oligarchs are, was a statement released a couple of days ago by David Cameron, the former British Prime Minister, who's now the British Foreign Secretary, and they brought him in there to try and save the Sunak government. He issued a statement with Annalena Baerbock, the clueless foreign minister of Germany. And what did they say? They said, we need a ceasefire in the Middle East. However, it has to be a sustainable ceasefire, because if it's not sustainable, it will break down and there'll be more killing. So until we can get a sustainable ceasefire, we shouldn't have a ceasefire. So in other words, because we're afraid a ceasefire will break down and lead to killing, we have to let the killing continue. That's the kind of double talk, but it's also a cover your ass approach. They're trying to show that they're trying to do something to protect innocent civilians, which they're really not. And immediately people saw right through this. So right as we're speaking, there's a resolution that's being introduced, I think in about 2 hours at the UN Security Council, a new resolution for a ceasefire. Now, the United States is getting boxed in. The last UN Security Council resolution for a ceasefire, the US vetoed it. 13 of the nations voted for it and 1 abstained. Then it went to the UN General Assembly. Now, the Security Council has some authority to carry things out, some authority. The UN General Assembly has no authority to impose its will, but 153 nations or 152 nations voted for a ceasefire, and I think 10 or 12 against. And the US was one of the major countries that voted against it. So it's clear the world is moving out from under this control of the war hawks. The problem is that as long as Biden is in, and as long as this militant crowd of neocons is running the country, the US is going to be for war. And so one of the things we're doing, you mentioned Rich Freeman, he's working on an article that will be out in the next week's EIR, which goes through how much of the budget ends up in the pockets of the shareholders and owners of the military-industrial complex, looking at Raytheon, looking at McDonnell Douglas, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed. It's a thorough study, and it sort of proves the point that some of these people are making, that when we say we're giving 113 billion to Ukraine, most of it ends up staying here. Well, who does it stay with here? The billionaires. So Richie's doing what I've seen so far of it is it's a compelling story that shows the fraud of the idea that you can spend your way out of a recession by spending on military and defense expenditures. And it also shows that it's not just 888 billion in the defense budget, which is what was reported with this National Defense Authorization Act, which passed last week, but that on top of that, there are 6 other sub-agencies that spend another 600 billion or have access to 600 billion in authorization, which means almost 1.4 trillion, 1.5 trillion goes into the various areas of defense and surveillance, the US side of the Five Eyes, and so on. So this article will be very important for people to put some faces on what we mean when we talk about the military industrial complex.
Folks, if you're new to EIR, it's Executive Intelligence Review. It's published by the LaRouche organization, and you can look at the extensive archives, which I love to read through, at larouchepub.com. And that's where I spent a good number of hours in the past few days reading those articles and thinking about them and following the leads. Things that are written 20 years ago or 30 or 40 years ago can explain things from a current perspective of the writer that is really enlightening to us looking in hindsight, trying to find out what really happened. And these articles are so well written, especially by guys like Richard Freeman and the great Jeffrey Steinberg. Well, excellent. I watched another video, which I'll take the opportunity to recommend strongly. It's called The Great Taking, and it's by an economist by name of David Webb. And boy, it's amazing. It's scary. The way that everything they do is legal, right? That's one of the principles that they have is that it's going to look legal. So if you remember I remember when reading about Sullivan and Cromwell and in that book that I read about how they first got all the commercial codes in the country to agree with one another. They went around to each state and they got the legislatures to write these laws that eventually became the commercial code that was applicable all across the country, and in fact became the Uniform Commercial Code that we study in law school. Now, what they've done is they have altered this Uniform Commercial Code without telling anybody. And now, if you own some stock, if you have a broker, and you own some stocks through that broker, and that broker goes bankrupt, what happens to your stock? Well, you get it back, right? I mean, they went bankrupt, but you didn't go bankrupt. You didn't take the risk. They're the ones that must have mismanaged their company. And it's too bad, but I get my stock back, right? Nope, you don't get it back anymore. Now it becomes part of the bankrupt estate. Well, how did they get away with that? So, and then he goes on to explain how they've created these institutions with really blasé names like the International Trust for something, and within that they've created these instruments that appear to be legal, but the effect of it is that even though you think you own a piece of stock, you don't. You own a claim to the piece of stock, and that claim to the piece of stock is what the brokers have sold you. And so the brokers, they only own, they are just selling you the appearance of owning stock, not the real owning of stock. And nobody knows this. And I'm thinking, oh my God, anytime they want to, they can just pull the plug. If that's the way it is, they can just say, okay, we'll just start toppling the house of cards whenever the timing suits us, kind of like they did when we had the great bank holiday and in the 30s. And it's just but it's planned, and he's detailed it so well because he's been an insider for his whole career. His name is David Webb, and it's really takes your breath away to see what they've done.
Well, it sounds like the same kind of sleight of hand that's at work with derivatives,
Yeah,
where
it is
you
that.
buy and sell something which gives you a claim to something which is derived from something of value, but has no value in itself. And at the point at which it starts unwinding, you're left with nothing. The classic case, you open your vault and moths fly out. But meanwhile, the traders have made a fortune buying and selling these things. And even the name, a derivative, and if you look it up, the definition of a derivative is something that is derived from something of value but has no value in itself. So why is that legal to buy and sell those? More importantly, why is it acceptable that commercial banks can dip into their clients, their depositors' money, and use that money to buy and sell them, where you get none of the profit that they get from the buying and selling, but if it blows up, you take the loss. That's the same kind of thing that you're describing from the Great Taking.
Yeah, and it's confiscation. It's nothing less than confiscation, like they confiscated everybody's gold in 1933.
Well, it's the biggest con game is when you take away the regulation from banking. And look, it's easy to come out against regulation because some government agencies went overboard with regulation, like the OSHA with the grade of toilet paper you're allowed to use in corporate bathrooms. But more importantly, there were regulations that were put in place to stop this kind of fraud. And in the interest of so-called free markets, they basically did away with most of these regulations. Then after it all blew up in 2008, they came up with this con game called the Dodd-Frank bill, which essentially gave the Derivative Dealers Association and the Credit Swap Association the authorization to write the rules governing what they do. And that was this great hero, Barney Frank, that he's the one who did this, essentially giving the keys to the kingdom to the thieves. So, this is what has to stop. And, it may take, I was talking the other day to someone who's used to be a banker here in Switzerland. He used to be with the government in oversight of the Union Bank of Switzerland and Credit Suisse, which he said are totally corrupt enterprises, but are protected by the Bank for International Settlements. But what he said is that all of these rules that the European Union has written in recent days, the new standard, amounts to nothing except the right for the private banks to steal. And the losses go to the government. And by the government, basically the tax authorities of the government to squeeze it out of the population. And I think that's what people need to know when you look at someone like Jamie Dimon testifying before the Congress. He knows what he's doing. JP Morgan Chase has been fined repeatedly for fraud. They just increase the margin of what they take from their depositors to be able to cover the fraud, to be able to cover the fines. So this whole system needs what they called once the hellhound of Wall Street, Pecora, who was brought in with some accountants, and they sat down back in the days of the green eye shades. They sat down and went line by line through JP Morgan's bank. And when they brought in JP Morgan for questioning, JP Morgan figured out very quickly they knew exactly what he was doing. And so he had to at least be honest or have a fairly good cover story because they had him dead to rights. And at that point, they could have taken the bank away from him, but they didn't, because they said if they did, there'd be no institutions for the generation of new credit for production. So, if we come up to another opportunity this time, a post-2008 collapse or 2019, we have to put these banks into bankruptcy reorganization, put the bankers who do this put them on trial at least, and reestablish a public trust in these institutions, which doesn't exist right now.
And to that point, part of the information in the video called "The Great Taking" I referred to a minute ago was about how the elites have already fashioned a kind of a financial bomb shelter for themselves, in that they've created these laws that are very, hard to find. It's kind of like going down a rabbit hole trying to put together what's the real bottom line of what all these laws mean together. But what they've done is they've created a way, and the justification resonates with what you just said, and that is, well, if everything crashes, we've got to have something left to start over with. So we're going to protect, the the best of the best of the best, the elites of the best, from all the rest of the chaos, just because we have to, because if we don't, then there won't be anything to start over with. And someone in the chat room said "too big to fail" or jail. That phrase of "too big to fail" was a good one. It made the point, but at the same time, people accepted it. They said, "Oh, well, okay, and we had to bail them out. They were too big." Poor Lehman Brothers. Geez, we had to bail them. AIG, gosh, they're too big. We've got to bail these people out, and that gets to what you and I talk about so many times, and that is, where's the political will to assert our government's duty of oversight of these institutions, so that the people of this United States don't get screwed and lose everything to these swindlers.
Well, in fact, the whole idea behind "too big to fail" was that when Lehman Brothers was put under, there were several weekends of discussions. We called them weekends at Bernie's, because Bernie Bernanke was the Federal Reserve chair. They met at Federal Reserve offices or at JP Morgan Chase offices in New York to try and figure out what to do as the mortgage-backed securities bubble was unwinding. And all of the bankers were sitting there knowing that they were leveraged much higher than allowed by law. I mean, Lehman Brothers was probably the worst. It was $38 of debt for every dollar of actual assets. And many people basically say that the dollar of assets was questionable also. But as they were sitting around discussing what to do, they made a decision to let Lehman Brothers go under. And the head of Lehman at the time was sitting there in this meeting when he was informed that his bank was going to be put through reorganization, bankruptcy, and so on. And he said, "So now I'm the schmuck? What about the rest of you?" And they all turned away and basically figured, well, we'll be able to make it. We'll let this Lehman be the sacrificial lamb. Well, that was on a Saturday. By Sunday, it became clear that all the rest of them were going to go the way of Lehman. And so that's when they came up with this idea of TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Plan, which on the surface was $700-800 million, but ended up being trillions. They had to come up with a much larger amount of money. Actually, I'm sorry, I think it was 700 billion was the TARP plan. Neil Barofsky, who was in charge of the Inspector General looking at it, said that as the whole unwinding from 2008 finished, it was about $23 trillion of bailout. And where did that money go? Well, it went to sustain the values at face value of the bonds and the financial instruments, many of which were worth nothing, but it kept them on the books and it enabled them to, as they say, kick the can down the road. And so that's the way the thing ended up in 2008, because what happened is Obama came in and Obama basically rubber stamped the Hank Paulson plan for the bailout, which was, of course, the JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, and so on. And they bailed out the insurance companies. They bailed out everyone except the homeowners, who were the ones left with nothing. Now, they did the same thing again in 2019. They did it in a more sneaky way. But according to the Wall Street on Parade website, this was another expansion of tens of trillions of dollars, what was part of the so-called quantitative easing policy, the second phase of quantitative easing. And then when that triggered inflation, everyone said, where did this inflation come from? As though printing fake money isn't a cause of inflation. And so now we're sitting here where the Biden strategy for re-election is to keep the war going in Ukraine, support Israel, spend more on defense because they figure this will put money into the economy, and then do bailouts. And what happens? Well, what's going on now? The stock market's going up. Companies that are not making profits are seeing their stocks go through the roof. So they're doing the same thing right in front of us as a re-election campaign. Now, it's interesting, when this happened in 2016, when Obama did it to try and help Hillary, Trump called him on it. Trump said, how can these companies which are not making profits have their stocks go up? This is a bailout. But by 2019, 2020, when he was running for re-election, Trump had the same policy with this tax cut that he introduced. Because some people said, well, this is like a Kennedy tax cut. No, it wasn't. It was a tax cut that had no obligation of the person getting the tax cut to invest it into something useful. And so companies got the tax breaks. They took that money and bought their own stock. And as the stock went up, they got their bonuses. So for those people who say Donald Trump had the right policy, he actually did what he correctly criticized by Obama and Hillary Clinton for. Now, it'll be interesting to see if he goes after Biden on this, because this is what Biden's plan is right now, to use military spending and lowering the interest rates beginning next year to try to stimulate the economy to make it look like things are good.
Fascinating. My gut reaction is I don't think that Trump really needs to take Biden down. I think Biden's already down, and
taking himself down.
So he won't need to do that so much. And matter of fact, as long as people can afford their gasoline and their heating oil and everything, nobody's going to be all that upset about the economy. I mean, the economy, such as it is, seems to be all right now, and coming back from the horrible time of the lockdowns. But in a way, what you've told me is that everybody caves at some point, because what else are you going to do? Well, what would have happened if the powers that be just said, sorry, Lehman Brothers, but sometimes you fail and you're going to fail, so get ready to go to bankruptcy court, and
that's what they should have done with all the others.
But what would happen if they did that? Why is it so scary to let these big companies go bankrupt?
Well, what would happen is that you do a bankruptcy reorganization, so the whole thing doesn't flatten at once. Mm-hmm. But you figure out, you do an audit. This is what the FDR policy was when he first came in. You audit the companies and figure out how much of this debt is never going to be covered. And you put that in a separate institution. You cordon it off from what's potentially healthy in the bank, so that you find out if there's anything healthy in the bank. If there is, you can generate new credit to that bank, probably under new leadership, but new credit for the sake of investment in something that will produce a return, a profit. And what they did with the bank holiday, this is what the so-called bank holiday in 1933, what they did is they figured out how much of this debt is never going to be recovered. how much can be recovered, how much of it is based on something that's tangible assets. And they divided it up, and they allowed the banks to carry on their books a certain amount of the uncollectible debt to write off over time. And as they wrote it off over time, they could get a credit for it, provided they did the other side of it, which is get new credit into production. That's the way you have to do that. Now, it does mean a huge portion of this. I mean, look, we're talking about huge sums of money, $33 trillion US government debt. We're talking about huge amounts of corporate debt. We're talking about record levels of automobile debt, of home debt, of credit card debt. So, what happens when someone runs up a credit card and they lose the credit card? Well, hopefully they can find a job. Hopefully there'll be some help for them till they can get back on their feet. But this is where the fiscal conservatives play a bad role. They say, well, it's your own fault. You lost, you have to suffer. And you can't do that when the fault is not the individual purchaser. I mean, look, some people do blow out credit cards because they're just trying to pay bills, or some of them go on fancy vacations and do stupid things. But you can't let a whole society collapse when in fact the whole society is oriented toward this quick buck speculation. You do have to stop it at some point. And that's what the bankruptcy reorganization laws were meant to do. If a company is bankrupt, you put it into bankruptcy and you figure out, what were you doing that was wrong? What were you doing that is potentially viable? And let's get a new business model. Instead, we just keep doing the same thing and give them more. If you're too big to fail, you have your credit line restored and you can keep building up the debt. Now, when you bring this question up, someone's got to put their foot down. I just wanted to mention, if people hadn't seen it, they should look at the 4-hour press conference that Vladimir Putin did a few days ago, where he took questions from large numbers of people in Russia. And they weren't all softball questions. The Western media says this was a contrived, controlled discussion. Well, actually, people called in and said, we can't afford eggs. Why are the prices of eggs so high? A veteran who had lost an arm in the war said, I can't get treatment. Can you look into this? Why are we not getting treatment for our veterans? Now, imagine Biden trying to answer questions like that for even 4 minutes, much less 4 hours. And not only did Putin answer, but he instilled confidence, because this was somewhat like the fireside chats, where the leader shows his commitment to doing what is necessary to help the country. And of course, Putin has a record now that's a good record. While the rest of the world is at zero growth, Russia is heading to a 3.4% growth rate in 2023, possibly close to 4% next year. China's still growing, even though it's got some problems and it's writing off a lot of bad debt. Most of the European countries are at zero growth or below. Germany's now in an official recession. So people should watch Putin and listen to him and think about what he's saying before you just say, this is a stunt, Putin's corrupt, Putin's no good. And what he said about the United States and Europe was really interesting. He said most European leaders think they're like Charles de Gaulle, doing something good for their country, but they're not. They're more like Marshal Pétain, who was the Vichy leader who basically carried out Nazi policies in France as a frontman for the Nazis. And Putin said that's what the European leaders are like. They're doing what the American empire wants them to do. And he said if they were to stop it, we'd be happy to start working with them again. In fact, the United States is an important country. We'd like to work with the United States, but not as long as it continues these imperial policies. So it was very straightforward, straight talk, tough talk, but it shows why Putin has a very high poll rating, and why the Russian economy survived the sanctions and the wartime policies against it, while the people who issued the sanctions, the countries that sanctioned Russia, it boomeranged on them. They're all affected by it in a negative way. So it's just an interesting contrast. And when you asked earlier, what's the good news in the world? Well, the Russians and the Chinese and a number of other countries are committed to developing the former colonial sector of the world. And this is where most of humanity is located. And if we changed our policies in the West, in Europe and the United States, we could be a partner in that. Because the Chinese and the Russians have offered partnership to the West, whereas you go back to Obama's Asia Pacific strategy, it was exclusionary. It excluded China. The current policy of Biden excludes Russia. The Germans, who need trade with Russia, need trade with China, are going along with the suicidal policies of the UK and the US. So there's a potential there for positive change, but it's going to require changes in leadership in the West. And I don't see anyone in the US talking about this other than what we're saying.
Yeah, there's no political leadership in favor of what we've been talking about, and that's always been the problem. I mean, I think your organization it deserves to be in the first place in terms of proposing economic solutions. The trouble is that they don't want economic solutions. They just want they don't. They want to keep the party going.
Undiminished power.
That's right.
Putin said some funny things about the rules-based order, where he said, where are the rules? It's the rules made up by the people who benefit. It's not international law. It's not the UN Charter. It's a phony. And this, of course, is something that we've been saying for a long time. Poor Blinken goes around the world talking about the rules-based order while he's defending the Nazis in the Ukrainian defense and security forces, while he's defending the genocide going on in Gaza. You have the Lloyd Austin going to Israel saying, basically, it's okay to kill, but do it in a more concentrated way. And then after Austin says this, what happened yesterday? Israeli snipers shot and killed 2 women at the one Catholic church in southern Gaza and wounded 7 others. Now, is that more precise targeting? You look at a picture of these 2 women, do they look like they're Hamas terrorists? And yet snipers presumably have sniper sights and can see this, and yet that's who they shot. So that was, I think, a signal sent to Biden and Austin and Blinken that, don't tell us what to do. We're going to do what we want to do.
Yeah. I try not to look at when there's posting on Twitter of some atrocity by one side or another, and I try not to look. But I saw one last week of this little boy out in the street, and he was reported to be 12 years old, and they just shot him. And the poor kid, was trying to get out of the street, but he found that his legs didn't work, and he just gets mad and he pounds the sand, and he's so angry that he can't move, and oh, it just breaks my heart. These scenes happening all the time, and this dehumanization of humans, that is the whole psychology behind the ability to do that. I mean, they have to psych themselves up to be cruel like that. It's not a natural human trait at all, but they can develop it. Especially in groups, and with the incredible power of psychological influencing of young minds now. It's
well, and I think some of this, including some of the videos that you see now, are designed to desensitize us, to convince us that this is normal, and that people can be shot down like animals. There was a scene that was described in the Times of Israel, which is an Israeli publication, of a discussion in the Israeli cabinet with the head of the Israel Defense Forces, where he said he is going to investigate the shooting of the 3 hostages trying to escape, who clearly They had no shirts on. They were waving a white flag. And the head of the Israel Defense Forces said, had that been Hamas members running out waving a white flag, it would have been our policy not to shoot them. And Ben-Gvir, who is this hardcore ideological extremist, who's the national security advisor to Netanyahu, said that's wrong, and it's wrong to punish the soldiers who do that. And the head of the Israel Defense Forces said, well, we're following the rules and laws of our military, and that's why we're investigating and may prosecute the people who did the firing. And Ben-Gvir said, yes, but we're the government, and we're telling you you can't do that. And so this was something that was filmed. You see the fight going on between the hardcore Greater Israel beastmen like Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu, against a military that's got an absolutely untenable situation and is trying to, at least some of them are trying to abide by international agreement, and they're under attack by their own establishment, their own government. So, it is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking because we're talking about human beings, and here we are, it's Christmas time. This was a Catholic church in Gaza that treats disabled people, that takes care of people who are disabled, that's being targeted by sniper fire by the IDF. And there was a statement issued by all Christian religious groups in the town of Bethlehem to Biden calling for a ceasefire and saying, you know, this is the time of year where people look to Bethlehem. And yet in the West Bank, Palestinians, Muslims, and Christians, and there are Christian Palestinians, are being subjected to beatings by radical settlers. So, when we were talking earlier about looking for something positive, we've got to rely on that strength in ourselves that recognizes the humanity in others and act to try to bring that back into the forefront of policymaking.
Getting people used to seeing horror has been another theme of my life. Where I watch people paying money to go see things like the zombies apocalypse, or the bloodthirsty ant monsters, or whatever they think of, and they go and they get that adrenaline rush or something. But it's worse than that, because it's psychologically getting you in a sense of, well, yeah, that's terrible, but it exists, and the horror of fantasy can be a pre-programming in a sense of the mind to accept the horror of reality. I think they do that. I think they know very well how to set up people to accept these horrible scenes as just, well, necessary. It's the march of civilization. Come on, these people are savages. You can't expect savages to just adopt civilized behavior. You can't. They're savages.
Well, and the centerpiece of civilized behavior is compromise. It's negotiation. It's diplomacy. It's discussion. And when that's finally concluded that it's impossible, then you may have to go fight. But to leave that out as an option, as the West did with Ukraine, the West told the Ukrainians, don't negotiate with Putin because we want to destroy Russia. And we're going to use you as the battering ram. And now in Ukraine, there's a rebellion going on against Zelensky. But Zelensky is still the key for the country to getting the money from the West. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens now, because the European Union's $50 billion package over 4 years was halted. And the US, the Biden policy of an extra 60 plus billion was stopped in the Congress. So what happens to Ukraine? What happens to the cronies of Zelensky who are counting on extra money coming in to make their life better? So, we may be seeing the wind down in Ukraine, but for Biden, the idea of losing Ukraine would be, for his top people, that's a loser for the upcoming election. And again, maybe that means there'll be a change in policy, but who's going to do it? Who's going to change the policy?
Well, Donald Trump says he'll change the policy, and he's probably going to be the next president unless something major changes between now and the election. And if thank God, I think we'll have an election. I hope we have an election. But the Obamas were listed as producers of this new movie that's getting a lot of press. I don't remember the name of it, but it's something like it's kind of like the day after movie where the America has split. We've got these states on this side and those states on that side, and it's just a kind of a tale that I haven't seen, but my wife's described it to me as it really is a scary movie in the sense that you don't know what's going to happen. Once the next civil war starts, nobody knows what's going to happen, and that again, that can look like a threat. With the Obamas for some reason being listed as the producers, it's not hard to see the idea behind it being, my way or the highway, and mic drops on the USA.
Well, just keep in mind the Biden policy is largely scripted by the alumni of the Obama presidency.
Hmm.
So Obama has a stake in seeing this carried out through to the end.
Well, we need everything exposed and spread about to those people that are not ideologically committed already, but just trying to do the right thing. And I think that's at least 70% of the country is just ordinary people trying to do the right thing, and they live within their communities, and they get their news feed, and their Twitter feed might be totally different from mine, and their Facebook might be completely programmed by the CIA to make sure that they think this way or that way. But nevertheless, we have to have faith in the idea of common sense. We have to have faith in the idea that Americans are, in fact, aware of the importance of liberty and the importance of preserving our individual rights through enforcement of law and respect for law. And we are people that respect the law. And the people that are above the law, well, they don't respect the law. We can't let them get away with it. That's the key. We've got to hold their feet to the fire when we see them blatantly abusing the privileges that they have and probably didn't earn in the first place.
Well, my final word for the 2023 is it's good working with you, John, and we've got to make sure that 2024 is a different year, a better year.
All right, Harley, here's to that. Better 2024. And thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you then.
And Merry Christmas to everyone.
Merry Christmas to you and your family and everyone else. Thank you all, and we'll see you soon.